Did you know that across the United States of America, there are thousands of massive, bizarre arrows, most of which are made of concrete, though sometimes they are formed from the structure of a building. And it gets weirder, because these arrows are found in the most isolated areas of the country, and for the most part, they've been completely abandoned. So, why did these unusual arrows seem to point to nothing, and what were they meant to guide? Stay tuned to find out as we discover the history of America's lost navigation arrows. I'm your host Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. Before we unpack why there are hundreds of massive, abandoned arrows littered across America, we have to navigate some very heavy history. It's important that you pay attention to these facts, but if you need something more entertaining to do with your hands while you listen, I'd suggest checking out this game. And it's worth sticking around until the end of this segment, since I'm going to show you how to get an exclusive bonus that most players miss. Raid Shadow Legends has AAA graphics and is currently running a massive Assassin's Creed collaboration. They've brought in iconic characters like Ezio, Edward Kenway, Bayek, Basim, and Cassandra, who is actually the first champion of the brand new Argonauts faction. I've been using Ezio lately. He's a master at weakening enemies with debuffs before striking. The best part? All players can get Ezio for free just by logging in for 7 days. Stick around for another week, and you'll get a full set of gear to make him battle ready. There's also a limited time event dungeon where you can fight the antagonist, Pontiff Augustine. He's using a piece of Eden for his own ends, but if you beat him, you earn exclusive Chronophae gear. To get started, scan my QR code or use the link in the description. My link unlocks a huge starter pack. You'll get the legendary Narma immediately, and the epic Mausoleum Mega at level 15. Plus, you can use one of these 6 codes on screen for another legendary. I recommend Money King for Sun Wukong. So now that your entertainment is sorted, let's get back to the lost arrows of America. This story begins in the years immediately after World War I, when aviation was still experimental, fragile, and dangerous. At this point, it had grown into a logistical solution so vital that the benefits outweighed the risks, a notion that sent many of the earliest pilots to an early grave. That's to say that there were some serious problems. For example, pilots flying the nation's first airmail routes had no truly reliable way to orient themselves once the landscape dissolved into something like darkness or clouds, a type of scenario that could be downright fatal. And so the federal government improvised with a few solutions. First of all, in 1918, the Post Office Department was tasked with delivering mail by air, and they knew that they had a major problem on their hands. So initially, the post office hired locals, often farmers, to light bonfires at set times, and these fires would guide the pilots. This was a kind of callback to those old signal files. From there, they innovated fast by building a nationwide system of illuminated beacon towers, standing roughly 50 feet tall and spaced several miles apart. These towers formed the invisible highways of America's early skies. At night, pilots flew from one rotating light to the next, stitching together a route across the continent. Over the years, approximately 1,500 beacons had been installed, including the main rotating beacons, the auxiliary towers, and non-standard beacons used in difficult terrain or remote regions. And this technology was remarkable for the time, as in a sense, the country now had a lighted airway stretching from coast to coast. Every third beacon was typically paired with some form of a landing field, but still, there was a very serious problem. These lights didn't offer much to pilots who became disoriented in things like fog during the daytime. Even so, they were expected to fly with that type of risk, and they did for nearly a decade. But then, in 1927, the airways were transferred to the Department of Commerce, and it was at this point that a new addition was added to the navigation mix, but this time on the ground itself. Enter the gigantic navigational arrows. At the base of many beacon towers, crews poured massive concrete arrows, sometimes stretching up to 70 feet long. Each one pointed towards the next beacon in sequence, turning the American landscape itself into a gigantic navigation chart. The logic here was simple. Each beacon had a number. Follow the arrow to the next number, and then repeat until you reach your destination. These paths were typically one way, as the arrows themselves didn't fork. Or to be more clear here, Each arrow was dedicated to a specific airway sequence. If multiple routes intersected, that decision point happened at the beacon tower itself, not on the ground, meaning a pilot would typically choose which airway to follow before takeoff or while circling a beacon, and then commit to that number chain until the end of the line. The arrows and the system at large were deliberately simple to avoid confusion. One arrow equaled one direction. Furthermore, they were purely directional. The assumption was that pilots already knew which airway they were flying and which numbered beacon came next. So adding any kind of text would have been useless at altitude and unreadable at speed. And to be fair, many pilots claimed they couldn't even really see these arrows clearly in the daytime, as there wasn't really a window looking down. Furthermore, pilots also carried paper airway maps and government-issued written route guides, so between the beacons, arrows, and maps, they were able to estimate the numbers, distances, emergency fields, fuel stops, and so on. Though there were ground markers to help them know where they should land. The airport fields themselves were marked by separate ground symbols, boundary lights, or even dedicated beacons. So, to summarize, the arrows basically conveyed one instruction. It meant to keep going forward. This wasn't a perfect system, but it was better than the alternatives. Even so, it wouldn't last. By the 1940s, as radio navigation improved and instruments took over, the arrows became completely obsolete and therefore were abandoned. And because they were made of such durable cement, many remain scattered across America to this very day. So now, it's time to have a look at what's been left behind. These days, you won't find a single preserved network of arrows or even a clearly marked trail. Rather, their existence is far more random. For example, out in the Mojave Desert, one arrow still lies pressed into the sand. Its edges are softened by the elements. In the Sierra Nevada, another sits near Donner Pass, sometimes buried beneath snow, but sometimes exposed just enough to remind hikers that this was once a part of a national system. Over in Pennsylvania, a concrete arrow can still be found at the former Department of Commerce Intermediate Landing Field. The outline of the arrow is visible on the ground, along with the remnants of the generator shed that once powered the beacon tower above it. Nothing around it really hints at aviation anymore, but the orientation still matches the original Salt Lake Great Falls Airway. Over in Medicine Bow, Wyoming, the remains are even more layered. This site once included a concrete arrow, a beacon tower, and a radio station. Today, the arrow footprint survives near the old field, marking a key transcontinental crossing point where pilots adjusted course through high plains and unpredictable weather. In Delaware Springs, their arrow lies near a historic water source along the El Paso-Fort Worth Airway. The surrounding land is still undeveloped, which is likely why the arrow was not yet destroyed. In Lovelock, satellite imagery clearly shows the unmistakable shape of the arrows in the desert outside town. These once pointed pilots towards the next beacon on the Western Airway that crossed some of the most remote terrain in the country. With that in mind, we also have to acknowledge that in some places, preservation was intentional. Museums like Grants Milan rebuilt entire stations using original plans, recreating not just the arrows, but the context around them. These reconstructions, perhaps better than anything else, really help explain a system in a way that the surviving originals might not. Then, finally, we have to discuss the arrows that were lost. Some of these were buried or lost to erosion, whereas many in the country's more densely populated regions were indeed demolished. You see, back east, the Federal Airway ran through some of the most rapidly changing landscapes in the country. Cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were already dense by the 1920s, meaning that they only accelerated from there. Hence, as the suburbs sprawled outward, the old arrows were torn up. You see, many arrows there were lost to the priority of America's agriculture and transportation backbone. Fields were plowed over time, and the arrows were removed, although there were some exceptions to this rule. As the 1940s arrived, developments such as VOR systems rendered the concrete arrows obsolete. Hence, instead of a physical arrow on the ground, the base station transmitted radio signals in every direction. From there, a pilot's instrument would tell them exactly which radio they were on relative to the station. And it's funny to think that, in a sense, the VOR systems actually mirrored the old arrow system in a poetic way. Just like the concrete arrows, those new stations were scattered across the landscape in remote areas, in predictable order, acting inevitably as an arrow. So, in terms of the concept, you might even say that until satellite, the arrow never really disappeared. But if you're a pilot watching this and have a different opinion, please feel free to let us all know in the comments section below. And a special thanks to Raid Shadow Legends for supporting the channel. Make sure you scan my QR code or use the link in the description to unlock that amazing starter pack. Otherwise, until next time, this is Ryan Sokash, signing off.